You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Hello, world, and welcome to Tales from Hollywoodland, a veritable feast of movies, Broadway, showbiz stories, news and gossip, with Julian Schlossberg, Arthur E. Friedman, and Stephen J. Rubin. Today's topic is movie bombs. And now, here's Julian, Arthur, and Steve.
Movie bombs, guys, I'll tell you, this is such a subject, and although we don't like to dwell on the negative, I have to say, as Arthur has once pointed out, the whole concept of knowing how much a movie makes probably dates from the birth of Entertainment Tonight in 1980, where all of a sudden everybody knew what the box office was. All those decades going back to the 20s, from the beginning of Hollywood, nobody ever knew what movies cost. Nobody ever knew what movies made. It was like a secret. And then the secret came out, and I think we'll all agree that the biggest bomb of our generation was probably Heaven's Gate, the Michael Cimino movie. I mean, that's a movie you can do essays on. And of course, Michael Cimino was the fair-haired boy who had just won a Best Picture Oscar for The Deer Hunter. And he became one of the latest auteurs, which of course is a French term for meaning he has total control. And it backfired on him. Arthur, you did some research on that recently, didn't you?
I did. The bomb, of course, the Hollywood movie bomb, evolved out of a period in the 60s when the auteur, the American auteur, came into vogue. And along came Warren Beatty, and to his credit, made a movie called Bonnie and Clyde, which did terrific business. And he had to fight the studio on it, but he won with it, and it did a lot of business. And therefore, it was kind of born right there. And it went on from there into other filmmakers who were in charge of everything on a film's production, like The Last Picture Show, The French Connection, Exorcist. There were any number of movies that were driven by the director. Coppola's Godfather, to say the least, even though he had a lot of problems with the studio, but it was really his movie. And so all this stuff happened, and then along came Michael Cimino, who did a very profitable picture called Deer Hunter, an incredible movie at that. And the auteur was really in vogue, and then came 1979 when Cimino made Heaven's Gate, which was like the most notorious bomb of that time. It kind of started it all. So I happened to look at a film magazine. I saw this little piece on it. I'll read it briefly. There are a few films more infamous than Heaven's Gate, the brainchild of once Hollywood superstar Michael Cimino. Film served as his follow-up to the acclaimed Vietnam War drama Deer Hunter. Its sweep of the 1979 Academy Awards saw Cimino walking away with the Oscar for both Best Picture Director and earned him a creative freedom with Heaven's Gate. He had creative freedom. And by the way, United Artists at that time was now being run by a money guy. I think his name was Andy Auerbach. So they really weren't the film guys that were David Picker and the people before that. So they were wide open to what was about to happen. And what happened was the tales of Cimino's dictatorial behavior have become the stuff of film infamy, ranging from refusing to begin filming until the clouds drifted to a position he liked, to demanding an entire set be demolished and then rebuilt because it looked slightly wrong. It poisoned his relationship with United Artists, but Cimino remained committed to his vision, confident he was making a masterpiece. And that's where, and they kind of gave him his lead. And he went and did a movie that came in and was so bad, it grossed $3 million, which in that day or any day was terrible. The cost of it was, let me get this thing straight if anybody has it, was $44 million that returned $3.5 million in the year of 1980. So that was the first notorious bomb. And
the original budget was, I think, $11.6 million, and it tripled. By the way, we should point out that Bonnie and Clyde was Warren Beatty's producer credit. He was the producer of the film. Arthur Penn actually directed Bonnie and Clyde.
Yes. But it was really Warren's movie.
It was Warren's movie, certainly. No,
okay.
absolutely.
So anyway, I want to finish this on a personal note. My older brother, Bob, was at the time a vice president at United Artists. So, and the head of the studio sent him up to Kalispell, Wyoming, to see what the heck was going on with this picture. Because the numbers were flowing in and it was terrible. So Bob went up there and he got off the plane. And the first thing he saw were about 1,000 crates of chili from Chasen's up there in Wyoming. And he made a fast note. And of course, everything else he saw was just disgusting, expensive things and crazy stuff that was going on. And it was really unchecked. He went back to New York, discussed it with the people, but it was too late. They were in quicksand. And as it turned out, the movie opened so badly after the $44 million expense, UA pulled it out of release. I don't know if you all remember that. It took it out of theaters and put it back in 30 days by cutting about an hour out of the movie. So that was really the first notorious bomb.
We really ought to point out a lot of things. Despite Bialystock and Bloom and the producers, nobody starts out to make a bad movie. Nobody says, I think I'm going to make a big bomb. But what does happen often is that mistakes are made. Mistakes perhaps in even saying, let's go with the movie. But having spent time in the studio system as I did, it's such a crapshoot, no matter what you're doing, no matter what film you're okaying, no matter what it is. I mean, you can take Alfred Hitchcock and say, I'm going to make my 50th movie, and he makes the hot #1 box office star, Paul Newman, and the number female, Julie Andrews, and he makes Torn Curtain. So this is not unusual to see bombs happen. What is unusual is the amount of money that's being lost now, the amount of money that's being spent now, but also the amount of money that's being lost. So let me just do one quick thing, if I may. We in the business know that if a film has done $70 million box office, it doesn't mean anything to anybody. If you're a participant, you get $35 million. The studio that made that movie is going to get $35 million. The other 35 is going to stick with the exhibitor. So if you have 10% of a movie, right off the bat, you don't have 10% of the 70, you'll have 10% of the 35. So on going online and looking at the internet, they are so incorrect in so many of the numbers that they have because they're working on a box office that is not a box office to the film company or to the distributor, either the studio or the distributor, who generally are both in many cases. Secondly, as Arthur certainly knows, prints and advertising are a gigantic expense, enormous amount. And invariably, they do not have that budget. They don't know what the prints and advertising that was spent. Some of the more honest sites say the loss was between 75 and 130 million. Well, that's right. That's more accurate because they don't know the numbers. So let's start out with the fact. Let's start, since Arthur brought up Arthur Penn and Warren. Remember, Arthur Penn made the movie. Warren produced it. And what Warren did was to go to Warner Brothers and say, this movie is dying and you're selling it all wrong. I want it out of release and I want you to bring it back the right way. And he did. That's what he did. Anyhow, let's talk in terms of the movie Giggly, if I'm even pronouncing it right. The Jennifer Lopez, Ben Affleck movie. Now, who directed it? Guy named Martin Brest. Martin Brest did Beverly Hills Cop. Martin Brest did Midnight Run. Martin Brest did Scent of a Woman. Martin Brest never made a movie again. That's right. That's the kind of experience he had on that movie, most likely, which lost over 100 million.
It was called Jiggly.
Giggly, okay. Yep. Whatever it was called, it probably should have been called Giggly. But anyhow, whatever. So I just bring that up. We all know that directors, as Arthur points out about the auteur theory, is a valid one. But you have great directors, as our number one director, perhaps, is Steven Spielberg. But he made West Side Story. We know that, and so, which sadly did not do well at all.
More recently, you have Marty Scorsese.
And you have Marty Scorsese in the was the Full Moon? Is that it or something?
You had Killing of the Flowers Moon, and then you had $200 million, which ain't going to do $100 million at the box office. And then you have The Irishman, which had a similar situation. Doesn't take away from his filmmaking; he's great, but the audience just didn't buy it, and it was very costly.
But if you're a studio head, you want to be in business with the Marty Scorseses and the Steven Spielbergs, because it's such a crapshoot anyhow that you might as well put your number on a horse that has had a huge success in the past. And that's why some of these movies do get made. I mean, James Cameron came back with the second Terminator. They didn't want Schwarzenegger. He fought to get Schwarzenegger, and Terminator 1984 went down the tubes. So, it's an interesting problem, and I'm going to throw it over to you, Steve. What's your first film of three?
Well, I just want to make a comment about The Irishman. As I recall, The Irishman was a Netflix movie that got a theatrical release and then got pulled. And I think there's this kind of weird kind of gray area now of streaming companies like Apple, Netflix, they're financing movies and giving them a limited theatrical run. But as a consumer, if I know that movie's going to be out on a streamer, I'm not running off to the box office right away. So some of these expensive movies the streamers are creating are to get their subscribers, not necessarily people running to the movie theater.
You have that right now with Maestro, Steve.
Right. I mean,
30 days.
Yeah. No, early days. I want to go back to Cleopatra, and I know that Cleopatra eventually made some money, and it actually was the biggest box office hit of its year, interestingly. But I think it caused such problems with a studio that was reeling already from some box office bombs that the entire fate of 20th Century Fox was in the hands of a series of incidents that almost sank the studio. The project originated as a Walter Wanger production. I think the first director on the movie was Ruben Mamoulian, who was a very fine director, directed one of my favorite movies, The Mark of Zorro. But Elizabeth Taylor, who received at that time, 1962, the unheard of sum of $1 million to play Cleopatra, was a frail young lady. And she got sick when they were filming overseas, and they had to stop the production. I think she was diagnosed with meningitis at one point. And I met John DeCure, the production designer, and when I worked on Ghostbusters, shooting behind the scenes, and John DeCure told me that he had to build, Rome 3 times. I think they built it in England, they built it in Cinecittà in Rome, and then they built it in the States. I have a familiarity with the state side of it because as a kid riding my bike next to the 20th Century Fox studios in 1963, almost every entrance had a giant Egyptian statue in front of it. The whole studio was surrounded by these great statues. They had turned Pico Boulevard and what was once Century City into ancient Egypt.
To be clear, the movie Cleopatra gave birth to Century City. They had to sell off most of the lot. Right. But that was the initial, again, eventually that was Cleopatra wound up being profitable.
It was profitable.
I'd like to tell a quick story about Century City. The biggest star that Fox had, where all the studios were downtown L.A., was Tom Mix. And his horse was named Tony. But Tony needed a place to graze, and they didn't know what to do. And they finally went to this area called Century City, which was all grassland. And Fox bought Century City, not for any brilliant real estate reason, but for Tony the horse. Yeah. I give you that.
I don't think it was called Century City then.
It wasn't. It
was just West Los Angeles. Right. No, it's true. It's amazing what property would have cost in those days. The studios bought these huge lots. I was going through a lot of bombs. One of the things I discovered is sometimes they put the wrong actor into a role. Everybody wants him to do an action piece, and they give him a different type of role. I was looking at the numbers on a movie from the 80s called Hudson Hawk.
Oh, yeah.
Bruce Willis.
Yeah.
Bruce Willis. Now, Bruce Willis, I think this is post, it may be pre-Die Hard, but Hudson Hawk had a budget of $65 million, which seems crazy for that kind of movie. And its total box office in the domestic market was 17. So that definitely is a case where you had people have expectations. I remember as a kid being obsessed with James Coburn as Derek Flint in those James Bond spoofs, Our Man Flint, In Like Flint. And I heard that there was going to be a movie called Dead Heat on a Merry-Go-Round, and I naturally assumed it was Derek Flint in action. It was not. It was a terrible movie. Just terrible.
One of the things that you learn, I think, when you get into production and you're involved with major studios, is they have people who work there that a lot of people make jokes of them, the executive, studio execs. Hey, you did this, you did that. The thing that they have that is brilliant at every studio are the people who make budgets at the studios. So in other words, the production company that they're paying for hands in a budget. They then take the studio then has people who then look over that budget, and they want to know line by line what's the cost. And after every line, they say $20,000, $82,000, every line of the script. They're great at that. So it's really shocking when something gets out of control, as do a few of these films, like Heaven's Gate. It got out of control. And once it's out of control, it's like anything else is out of control. It goes haywire. And says, how do you deal with this? You cut bait. Today they're doing that. Today they're, at a certain point that they're going to take the loss, write it off. But in those days they weren't doing that.
Well, when 20th Century Fox was making Titanic, they were very nervous at James Cameron's numbers, and they were spiraling and spiraling. And I guess the studio got so nervous, they made a deal with Paramount to co-release the movie. I think Paramount put up only $65 million of a $200 million budget, and they got half the world or more.
Who you mean Fox did?
Paramount got, Titanic was a Fox movie, and they made a co-production with Paramount.
With Paramount.
Paramount came in late, though. This movie wasn't developed for Paramount. Paramount, I remember reading this, that they wanted to make it a co-production. So they only
why did Paramount distribute the movie? They distributed it. I think it's the other way around. I think that it was Paramount and they sold off to Fox.
We can check that.
Let's check that.
In any case, one of those studios got very nervous and had to go to another studio to co-produce.
Yeah.
And it obviously produced one of the biggest hits in history.
And also let's now talk about for a second why the companies bought into the auteur concept, because they were so spoiled by some movies that cost almost nothing. And like a movie called Easy Rider that cost $400,000 to make and grossed $60 million. That'll turn heads, and that'll make them say, sure, let's go for the next guy, and all that.
That changed the production schedule of all the studios, making terrible movies. The Magic Garden of Stanley's Sweetheart and Strawberry Statement. I mean, they were making one after another. Young people are the answer. They're going to go see the movies because they went to Easy Rider.
Well, the same thing happened a few decades later when the Marvel universe developed. All of a sudden, in the early days of Hollywood, they liked the youth market for a few films per year. They would throw them a bone. Me growing up, I always got a Sinbad movie in the summer. I mean, that was considered a kid's picture. But with Marvel Universe, Star Wars, all these special effects driven movies, they're completely oriented toward the youth market. And I think we can all agree that if you are a person over the age of 40, there's very little to see on the big screen anymore because the screens are dominated by these big epic science fiction movies.
And the youth market you're talking about is no longer Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Chicago. it's worldwide.
That's right.
And so their gambles, they're looking for that's the $1 billion bills. But the youth market they go to the movies no matter what.
And if you're running a studio, can you imagine? Guy comes in and says to you, you're the head of a studio, I've got Robin Williams and I've got Billy Crystal, and guess I got Ivan Reitman's going to direct it. Well, you're going to make that movie. You're just going to want that movie. And of course, it was Father's Day, and I don't even think fathers went to see it. So those things happen. But, one of the things that's interesting, we talk about important director and he gets a movie made, even if maybe it shouldn't have been. Stars certainly do. But one of the things studios have done over the last years is remake successful movies and bomb.
Yeah.
And bomb. You've got the remake of Ben-Hur, or Around the World in 80 Days, or we said West Side Stories, or
Born Yesterday, or so many of these things.
Or a girl version of, or a lady's version of Ghostbusters, or the new Blade Runner. I mean, it just goes on. And again, it's understandable. You own the property if you're a studio. It was successful once. Maybe we can hit it twice. Yes. And invariably, it doesn't.
Let's go back to the brilliance of Warren Beatty, who was probably as great a salesman with regard to a project he would want to do to these studios that has ever lived. So he really is vitally important in the making of Bonnie and Clyde. And he had great things. After he did Shampoo, he did some other movies that did a lot of business. And somewhere along the line, the same Warren Beatty, God bless him, has an idea to do a picture called Town and Country. And the bottom line of Town and Country was that New Line, who financed and distributed, wound up paying a budget of $105 million. This could be the biggest bomb of all of them, Little picture, a little movie, Town and Country, and grossing $10 million. And Mike DeLuca then went to work for MGM, afterwards. It was, those things happen. But that to me, from a personal standpoint of view, to think of the high intelligence of the people who budget movies at studios or any financing entity, you've got to have people or that person who really knows how to budget so they can check the budget from the producer. For that to happen, $100 million that's a small movie no matter what, to get out of control is astounding.
Well, it's a small movie as far as the script author, but when you have Warren Beatty, you have Goldie Hawn, you have Diane Keaton, you have Gary Shandling, who at that time meant something, you've got above the line that's expensive right off the bat.
But in no world would it be $110 million. It's just staggering.
Movie making sometimes reminds me of going to the body shop to repair your car dent. They touch it with a little bit of something, $3,000. I mean, to get a feature movie made theatrically these days. And I think one of the key areas we got to talk about is the cost of marketing, how marketing has spiraled. Because if you're going to open a movie nationwide, and since Jaws in 1975, the big nationwide release is kind of a thing now, and it's been for many years, the marketing costs are enormous. And that's why the independent filmmakers, the ones who make good little movies, very seldom get much of a release. Sometimes they do it, most often they don't.
Well, that's true. And go ahead, Off.
Woody Allen is always famous for coming in on right on the budget, on time, and his pictures, for the most part, have profited. The Cotton Club was an interesting situation too. Francis Ford Coppola directing the movie. Somebody gets murdered during the movie, really gets murdered, and it brings notoriety to this movie, and it becomes infamous, and that helps towards doing a movie rather than being profitable, coming in at $25 million on a $58 million budget. We'll go back to what Julian was saying, the theory of using $70 million. $70 million gross, yes, half or more than half goes to the studio. But then you start tacking on the expenses of it. What did the picture cost? Well, it cost $100 million. So the $100 million is now added onto what happened. So you're left with 35 million. You're back by 65, but then there's all kinds of other things that come in, including marketing. And it can be a tough game. But when you're a big studio, you can write those losses off to big hits. And that's how the game is played.
And we should mention also that depending on what year we're talking about, there's an interest factor on the money.
Yeah.
And that interest factor can get very big. For example, on Town and Country, it took them 3 years to make the movie. So you've got interest on that money for 3 years. It's a very tough game, the studio system, which is one of the reasons almost all of them are just part of a huge company. They're no longer a studio that stands alone. They're part of a giant conglomerate.
And thus, it's no longer one guy who sits in his chair and says, I've got a good idea for a movie anymore. Now there's a list of people stretches out the door of people who have to be weighed in on it. It's just crazy. Okay, I'm going to list some cast members from a movie last year, and let's see if you know the title. Christian Bale, Margot Robbie, John David Washington, Chris Rock, Michael Shannon, Mike Myers, Taylor Swift, Timothy Olyphant, Zoe Saldana, Rami Malek, Robert De Niro. That is what I call a killer cast.
Amsterdam.
How many people went to see Amsterdam? Not too many.
Not even the Dutch.
Look, guys, it's a crapshoot. The movie business is a crapshoot. You're dealing for big marbles, and
Amsterdam didn't necessarily lead to Snake Eyes, but it had an $80 million budget. Its worldwide gross was 31. So as we know, that 31 is really 16. So it was a major loser. And it's
that's
funny.
Without prints and advertising.
That's without prints and advertising. I mean, the thing is, there used to be a certain guarantee if a certain actor was in the movie, then you had a guaranteed box office. And I think I don't know if there are any actors anymore that are guarantees. However, in terms of track records, I would say that Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, if you look at the numbers on the majority of his films, he delivers an audience. And he seems to be very smart on determining what makes a good movie for him. And there are very few. Who if Bruce Willis during his heyday was not in a Die Hard movie, there were no guarantees.
Well, the same with Stallone. If he wasn't Rocky or Rambo, nothing would happen with him.
Yeah, he's had one of the great careers in the history of the business. Between Rambo and Rocky, there's probably 10 movies there. Creed, he also did, what was it with the mountain climbing, Steve? Cliffhanger or something?
Cliffhanger.
Yeah.
Cliffhanger. He's had success.
And then he's had that franchise he's been involved with called The Expendables, which started out very strong and this kind of petered out.
They're still working, though.
But in terms of...
what was interesting for me to read, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, that when The Wizard of Oz opened in 1939, it bombed. It didn't do business. It didn't go to it. And it took 10 years, and MGM had a re-release in 1949, and it did business. But what pushed it over the top to make it the number one film, according to the Library of Congress, seen by everybody, a movie that's been seen by the most people ever, was when it went on 1956 onto CBS network and played year after year after year. So it's interesting that incredible movie started out not successful. The second one that we all know is It's a Wonderful Life.
Yeah.
It's a Wonderful Life. And the only reason it became the cult movie it came was that it went into public domain. The copyright lapsed. And so television picked it up. Everybody was playing It's a Wonderful Life, and they discovered how terrific that movie was. So that's kind of story. Those are interesting stories of movies that people think were huge from the beginning, and they weren't, either of them.
I think, as I recall, Frank Capra had started a production company with two other filmmakers. It's a Wonderful Life essentially sank those aspirations.
I think it was Liberty. I think it was called
Liberty Pictures. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
A friend of mine who was just got the job to run a major studio, Universal, I won't mention his name, On that first day in office, he was visited by another ex-studio head who they understood the business. And the ex-studio head gave him this advice on his first day on the job of running a studio. Take the first 10 scripts that have hit your desk, which means they've gone through the process, and you now have 10 scripts in front of you. Green light all those 10 scripts. You'll have the same 1 or 2 hits that you will if you go crazy trying to read everything and what have you. That's the nature of how crazy the game is. Now, was he right? To some extent, he is. There's a percentage factor in what hits and what misses. But again, the key to the financing entity being the studio is the budget. How much it costs. Julian, anybody you know, whoever I know, if they're in that chair to greenlight a movie, the questions are always the same. Who's directing? Who's the star? How much does it cost?
That's right. And the other thing is, because we've produced all of us, a movie, unlike, let's say, a theater, a movie has a life of its own. When you start shooting that movie, if you think that you're in control, you're kidding yourself. You're on the train and you're trying to keep it from derailing, but it takes on a life of its own. And the director will tell you that, producer will tell you that. Certainly, I think we've all experienced that. So the idea that the studio has okayed a budget and then what can happen can be crazy. I had an important scene we were shooting, and we called Newark Airport to make sure we had all the travel flight, because obviously it was an exterior, and if planes would be flying over, that we couldn't shoot because the noise would be drowning us out. We did everything right, and a day was lost because all the information we got from Newark Airport was not valid, and we just had to keep trying to change the area, but it didn't happen.
But the bottom line of the movie business is it really is a different form of gambling.
That's what it is.
It's a crapshoot. So the studio is always going to want to make sure their budget is as best as possible can be, but sometimes these things happen and you get the bomb. And I guess that's what the theme of this show is. So, more bombs. There have been some bombs that most people have never heard of.
That's right.
And there's sometimes, getting back to my marketing thoughts, sometimes a good movie is marketed improperly, that's sold the wrong way. You mentioned Bonnie and Clyde. Warren wasn't happy with the way Warner Brothers was selling it. Billy Friedkin, another fair-haired boy coming out of The Exorcist, makes a movie called Sorcerer. Now, Sorcerer, as we all know, was based on a very successful French film called The Wages of Fear, about some guys delivering nitroglycerin down some very rocky mountain roads. Keeps you on the edge of your seat. But to call the remake, or Friedkin's version, Sorcerer, I thought was really a bad decision, because having that reputation from The Exorcist, what would you assume a movie called Sorcerer is about?
It's a bad title. I recognize that, but Steve, respectfully, there's a lot of bad titles. Some, by the way, do business. Again, it's the element of the unknown that flirts around the head of anybody who's in the business and putting money into it or making money from it. There's always the unexpected. You can look at it.
Go ahead on.
Yeah, you can look at a release schedule for the year. And I always used to look at it and say, the question is, what's going to be hit that's not here, that's not even here? Sometimes a hit comes along, and we had a picture at United Artists called "What Do You Say to a Naked Lady?" Alan Funt, who did Candid Camera. It wasn't even on the release schedule until 2 weeks before we released it, and it hit. So it's a risky business to begin with.
Just to look at the numbers, the budget for Sorcerer was $22 million. According to this statistic, the worldwide gross was $8,000. Which that must be some kind of typo.
That's a typo.
This is exact perfect example of what the hell they write that they don't know what they're talking about.
That can't be true.
What we should say that Billy was not only coming off Exorcist, before that was French Connection. So he had 2 huge hits in a row. You don't turn them down. You just don't turn them down at that point.
That's right.
It's simple. Let's talk about Ishtar, because I'm close to it. And the fact is, it was certainly considered a big bomb, et cetera, et cetera. However, once again, the facts are quite different from what you read. Not to say that it was a successful movie, but it certainly was not a bomb, as it turns out. Number one, most importantly, you read that Elaine May, the director who also wrote it, wanted the shoot in the Sahara Desert and wanted to flatten dunes. Well, this was nonsense. I was there. She did not want to flatten dunes. But why were we in Morocco? I shouldn't say we. Why were they in Morocco? Because Coca-Cola owned Colombia and they had blocked funds. They couldn't take the money out, so they might as well spend it. And that's right at the beginning. You start out with the fact that it was money that Coca-Cola had, not anything from the studio per se, even though they owned it. Number two, at that time, HBO was paying Columbia Pictures 40% of the budget of every movie they were making in order to have exclusive on it. These are things that are never printed, never sold, but that is the truth. Now, and I'm going to be off my soapbox in a minute. The New Yorker printed that this is a maligned masterpiece. The Guardian wrote that it's a totally undeserved its reputation. It's a fine movie. Quentin Tarantino calls it one of his favorites, and Martin Scorsese says it's one of the best pictures of all time. So there's a real different disparity feeling about it. A documentary was made called Looking for Ishtar by Canadian Documentaries, and it turned out that they went around to libraries where they couldn't get the movie in a store, so they went to the library who had the copies, and there were 50 people, 80 people, 100 people on the waiting list, and they interviewed these people why they wanted to see it. So it's an interesting story about how this movie has become a bit of a cult film.
But unquestionably, theatrically, it became synonymous with bombs.
Absolutely.
Because theatrically, it just did not do business. And sometimes life comes after the theater.
Yeah, look at The Princess Bride. There's an example. The Princess Bride was nothing in theatrical. What saved The Princess Bride and made it a very important movie was home video. Huge home video sales, and changed everything. So,
getting back to Ishtar, I was working for a rival studio at the time. New Century Vista was a fairly new studio. I think it was Norman Levy from Fox had come over to start it. And we had a movie opening the exact same weekend as Ishtar. It was called The Gate. The Gate was a little horror movie about three little boys who find the gate to hell with some extraordinary effects. We came within $100,000 of beating Ishtar for opening weekend gross.
Well, yes, I understand. You guys ever hear, you mentioned the Sahara. You ever hear the joke about the one-armed midget who is got an axe in his hand, and he goes, you know the joke? He goes to get a job cutting down trees in Oregon. The guy who's going to do a big forest, cut it down. So the guy comes in, he says, what do you want? He's a one-armed midget. He's got this axe. He says, I want a job cutting down your trees. He says, what, are you kidding? You're a one-armed midget. That's ridiculous. He said, well, yeah, but I do it really fast. So he said, well, I'll tell you what, you're here. Go ahead, go over to that area. And the guy cuts down. Before you know it, in 3 minutes, this guy's cut down like 200 trees. This one-armed midget. So he comes back to the foreman, and the foreman says, God, that's amazing. What's your last job? He said, my last job was the Sahara Forest. He says, "What? No, it's the Sahara Desert." He said, "Now it's the Sahara Desert."
That's one of the great Myron Cohn jokes. But the last line that Myron Cohn did was, he says, "The Sahara." You mean the Sahara Forest? He said, "No, Sahara Desert. Sure, now."
Yes.
I did just a couple other quick things on just the gossipy aspect of Ishtar. Guy McElwain was the head of the studio. He okayed it for Columbia Pictures. He got fired. In comes David Putnam. David Putnam has had a big, huge fight with Warren Beatty versus Chariot versus Fire versus the Reds, and they're both up for the Academy Award. They don't like each other. Dustin was in a movie called Agatha that Putnam produced, and Dustin had him thrown off the set. So he is not in great shape about this movie. He's got every reason to do what nobody ever does. He let the press know the budget. ahead of time. Obviously, Warren and Dustin at that point were at their height. Also, Warren made the decision to close the set to the press. That's a pretty frightening decision generally, and it didn't get the press too happy with the movie right off the bat. Interestingly enough, in Toronto, the first preview, it was a huge success. You'd never know it from what happened, but it was at that preview before.
And speaking of press, Warren and Dustin were on the cover of literally every magazine in America. The PR department pulled out all the stops. Absolutely. They did the job. And you know, sometimes when you have the stars, you can kick butt. I mean, I'm a big George Clooney fan. I mean, George Clooney I discovered on that ER TV series. And then, of course, his movies have been wonderful. The Ocean's 11 remakes were terrific. Then he did a movie called Tomorrowland. Now, Disney has this thing where they constantly repurpose things. They take a ride that everybody in the world knows and they turn it into a movie. And they've had kind of spotty success with that. But Tomorrowland was just a mess. I mean, I went because of Clooney, because usually Clooney is a guarantee of something being cool. And the movie was just a kind of, I don't even know what else to call it, but a mess.
But Disney also made a little movie called Pirates of the Caribbean.
Yes.
And that erased Tomorrowland 100,000 times. There was a movie that we read about not that long ago, just several years ago, that when I initially saw it in the trades, I thought to myself, just we do a lot of times, God, Steven Spielberg remaking West Side Story, can't miss. I mean, he wants to do a musical. What better thing than West Side Story? So it cost him $100 million plus advertising, which was probably, I'll bet you, $20 million minimum.
I bet more.
More, maybe. And the box office was $76 million, or in Julian's terms, minimum half, give it a little more. So they retained, out of the $76 million, they returned probably $40 million. So there again, this is the bomb. And you realize that they made a decision to make the movie, which I would have made that decision too. Would anybody turn down Steven Spielberg wanting to remake West Side Story in a more contemporary way? But, you're talking about the Sondheim music. It's incredible. Leonard Bernstein, and it misses. Crap game. It goes right back to the concept of movie business is a crap game. They're covered in so many different ways now because they're parts of large conglomerates. But nonetheless, they're covered by the mega hit that comes along and erases any number of bombs.
Now, you mentioned Pirates of the Caribbean. Johnny Depp is big as you can get. Johnny Depp is in The Lone Ranger. Yep. Johnny Depp is in The Astronaut's Wife. I mean, these are two gigantic losses.
That's why one studio exec said to the other studio exec, just don't even read the scripts, just approve the first 10 scripts, and that's it. The percentage will be the same. That's pretty insane.
I think generally star power guarantees you nothing. A few years ago, Warner's had a movie called Bonfire of the Vanities with two very hot stars, Bruce Willis and Tom Hanks.
Huge book.
Huge book.
And Melanie was no chopped liver at that point either.
Melanie Griffith was no chopped liver. It had a $47 million budget. Worldwide gross was 16, according to the numbers.
But did you ever see the movie, or ever attempt to see the movie?
I
did. Yes.
And I'll defer to you, Julian. Tell us what you thought.
It wasn't a bad movie. It just was way hyped up, as it often happens, and that turns a lot of people off.
Also, Tom Hanks, yes?
Yeah, he was in it. He was perhaps miscast, but he was in it.
Yeah.
We kind of sit around and have a show about this, but some of my favorite movies didn't do well, and I bet you guys would say the same. I mean, we talked about Marty Scorsese. He did a movie called The King of Comedy with De Niro, no less.
Right, love the movie.
And what a really interesting, good, funny, sad movie. Went right on its ass.
But it wasn't that expensive, though, Julie.
No, but I'm just talking about a movie off that was not successful, but was still plenty good, And I love this movie, Hugo, Hugo, which came and went, beautifully done, period piece in a way, and just a very compelling, terrific story, and yet nothing. So very hard to understand. We know Citizen Kane, what happened with that, but that was William Randolph Hearst and the power of the press to kind of squash it at its first release. So
I was at a sales meeting for United Artists in Fort Lauderdale one day. We have all the branch managers, everybody in the company is there, and the general sales manager in those days would go over the entire release chart, and he would say, this picture's about this picture's about this, and this is blah, 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 blah. And he comes to a movie called Billy Two Hats.
Oh, yeah.
Billy Two Hats. And
Mitchum.
somebody says to him, sir, could you please tell us what Billy Two Hats is about? And his response was, it's the best two-hat picture I've ever seen. Well, where do you go from there? Okay. Nobody knows. This is Bill Goldman. Nobody knows nothing. I mean, you know.
It's true. Arthur, you know the Coen brothers and worked with them and co-produced with them. Big
Invested.
Big Lebowski didn't do much, did it?
Yes.
I didn't think it did.
It was a winner.
Initially?
Very funny movie. We weren't involved with that. We invested. My partner.
No, I know. But are you sure initially? Because what I've read again, and could be incorrect, that it did not do well initially.
I can check that out. We'll check it out real fast. But I think Big Lebowski was profitable. The ones that we had, we invested in the production with Circle Films of Blood Simple in terms of distribution. Came out good on that. Then we got real lucky with a picture called Raising Arizona, which was terrific. But to this day, it's just, a moneymaker. And then we had a movie called Miller's Crossing, which was a great movie and never turned profit. And then a little movie called Barton Fink, which did turn profit. So again, that little small sample indicates how unusual things could be.
According to IMDb Pro, the budget for The Big Lebowski was 15. Its worldwide gross was 47.
There you go.
Lebowski
It was a hit. It was
successful. And once again, the internet is wrong. At least my internet.
Yeah. Well, we were involved with Joel and Ethan Coen for their first 4 movies, one to distribute and one that we were able to co-produce as I say, Circle Films. But the fourth one we were not involved in was Fargo, and Fargo was, of course, a big hit.
Yes. And in my estimation, probably their best movie. So for me, I think it was my favorite of theirs.
You ever seen Miller's Crossing?
I did. I liked it a lot.
Yeah, good movie.
Yeah.
So sometimes the title, again, I'll throw back my title ideas as being off bit. The Coen brothers did a movie called The Hudsucker Proxy. I challenge you to say that 3 times in a row fast.
With Paul Newman.
Budget, $40 million estimated. Worldwide grossed, 2.8.
I'd like to just interrupt you for a moment on that because there's a personal thing. So the first movie, the deal that was made with the Coen brothers with Circle Films, our company, was that we produced their next 3 films. And the first script they sent us was Hudsucker Proxy. Barbara, my wife, read the script and said, this is brilliant screenwriting, but it is cold, just cold. So we all passed. And their budget at the time was like $15 million or something. We passed on it. The next thing they sent to us was Raising Arizona. We took it. Years later, you're talking about Joel Silver Productions at Warner Brothers did produce Hudsucker Proxy. At that time, as you say, about $40 million. It did nothing. But we had a shot, and thank God we passed. Yes.
I'm thinking of another film that, again, the title wasn't exactly flying off.
We happened to manage a comedian named John Pinette, a fat guy, hysterically funny. John was terrific. And they sent us a script called Dumb and Dumber, and John refused to do it. He said, I don't want to do this kind of thing. It's too stupid and blah, 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 blah. And the rest of it. So there's a pass in the wrong way.
Another title.
Go ahead.
Another title that was questionable, but obviously based on Stephen King, was The Shawshank Redemption, which I would argue is the It's a Wonderful Life of today. Everybody loves The Shawshank Redemption. It's become a mythic film. Didn't do that much business back in the day. It only grossed 29 million worldwide. But sometimes it's a question of, can you get the title out of your mouth to start it? Now, the original title was based on a Stephen King novel called Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption. Well, they left off the Rita Hayworth and we got the Shawshank.
But you know what compensated for the title, Steve? Word of mouth.
Killer.
Which is you can't buy it. You cannot buy word of mouth. But that had great word of mouth, as did It's a Wonderful Life and all these other things that come to life.
No, true.
It's true. I wanted to ask you guys, I never saw this movie, but I wondered what you thought of it, if you've seen it. It was with Owen Wilson and Reese Witherspoon. It's called How Do You Know? Jim Brooks made it. It lost a lot of money. Did you guys see it? Do you know about it?
Never heard of it.
I've never heard of it, and I'm a big fan of both of those actors.
And Jim Brooks. So this is amazing. We are guys in the business. We know certainly the stars, and we're sitting here not knowing. I must say, I saw a list of movies that lost 100 million, 130. I never heard of these movies.
Well, it's because we're paying good word to the word of mouth. The word of mouth was lousy. I think sometimes we're looking for a reason not to go. And if I hear that there's a stinker in the box office, I try to stay away. What did I just say recently? Well, I have not seen the Scorsese picture, the Flower Moon picture. My big issue with the Scorsese picture is not so much the filmmaking quality. It's the fact that it's 3.5 hours.
Yeah.
To sit in a movie theater today for 3.5 hours, I have to say that the story has to be killer. And I saw the trailers. They looked okay. Did I want to run out and see it? No.
How long was Godfather?
Godfather was over 3 hours.
Yeah. I don't think it's the running time. Honest to God, I think it's the movie. I think the subject matter is just what it is. It's kind of depressing stuff. I'm sure it's brilliantly done, but it's not the public's favorite choice.
Sometimes it's grueling to see.
Remember a movie called Towering Inferno where they put together Queen and Paul Newman?
Yeah.
How could it miss? And it didn't. It didn't. They hit big with that movie.
But that was also...
We've discussed movies that have the similar kind of cast with the director, and all of a sudden it comes out and bombs.
And, the story of the Towering Inferno is interesting. The movie was developed by two different studios with a book that were very similar. One was called The Glass Inferno, and one was called The Glass Tower, I think. And so Warner's and Fox co-produced that movie. Very rare for studios to do really well together. I think the only other one I can think of is when we talked earlier about Titanic, where everybody made off like a bandit. Here's a movie that the title makes me think, what? Cowboys and Aliens. Cowboys and Aliens had a budget of $165 million. It did gross 175 worldwide, but, again, that's probably 80 worldwide if you take things like that. So that was a big bomb.
What year was that, Steve?
That was fairly recently. I think that was in the early 2000s.
Cowboys and
Harrison Ford and I think Daniel Craig, who became James Bond, I believe in it. I'll tell you it in a second. But that...
He was already James Bond by that point.
Okay, Cowboys and
Steve,
Aliens.
was there ever a James Bond movie that lost money?
No, there's never been. By the way, Cowboys and Aliens was 2011, so it's 12 years ago. The big thing about the Bond movies was they were very nervous sometimes adding a new James Bond. After Sean Connery left the series the first time, they brought in George Lazenby. And forever, George Lazenby will be considered a footnote because he only did the one film. And then because of some bad advice, he left the series and didn't take the contract. The grosses for Honor Majesty's Secret Service were not at the level that the previous Sean Connery Bond movies had done. They'd been dipping down a little bit, but the dipping was way too much on Secret Service. The movie was still profitable. But, when you start to make movies like Goldfinger and Thunderball, which are busting the box office charts, they don't want a Secret Service. So that's why David Picker went over to Scotland and he made an offer that Sean Connery couldn't refuse, which led to Diamonds Are Forever as the next James Bond movie. And that made the grosses jumped up considerably.
There was an exhibitor in Boston who had the Downtown Theater playing exclusively on Goldfinger. And he actually put in pay toilets. Can you imagine that? But they did it. It happened. In those days, he put in pay toilets, and some other exhibitors started saying, "You're disgusting. My theaters do more business than yours." And this exhibitor said to him, "My toilets did more business than your movie theater this weekend."
I think that's disgusting.
Yes, it is. Goldfinger.
Goldfinger was making so much money that the theaters in New York supposedly stayed open 24 hours a day.
Yeah, well.
It wasn't supposedly. It was a DeMille theater, and we did stay open.
Steve, what was the Bond movie that brought the series back that really hit big in modern, like 20 years ago, 30 years ago?
Oh, well, The Spy Who Loved Me, the third Roger Moore, catapulted the series to another level.
Yeah.
Roger's first two movies did okay, Live and Let Die and The Man with the Golden Gun. But The Spy Who Loved Me, which was released in the summer of 77, the summer of Star Wars, did big business.
Well, now, but beyond that, when the worldwide market exploded because of the new theaters in all of these countries, the Bond thing took off and went completely crazy. There was a movie that ignited that, and I'm trying to think of what it was, but I do think it was subsequent to 1990s. It may have been early 2000. Casino Royale.
When Daniel Craig came on as Bond for the first time in 2003, he did Casino Royale, which was a huge international hit.
Yeah.
Definitely. And by the way, I consider it, along with Goldfinger, as the best James Bond movie.
Well, just worth mentioning as relates to the bomb theory, the theory of the movie bomb, a lot of the people who greenlight these movies at 100 million or 200 million, whatever it may be, completely factor in what that worldwide market's going to be. If they think it can do business in Bolivia and Spain and Czechoslovakia, and because you can do business there in all those countries these days, because of the new theater and digital and the presentation, they greenlight on the worldwide market, not necessarily on domestic.
And we both know, all four of us know, that the foreign market, in many cases, is more than the domestic market now. And that was never the case when we were all younger.
Anything action adventure, Julian, is foreign geared. It's going to outgrow domestic. Story driven, of course, is here.
And action. You don't have to speak language. You
action adventure. That's right.
Chases and whatever. Yeah.
And animation has been a big plus for the studios because
huge.
Those actors, they don't need to be fed.
That's right.
Well, but the thing is that they've also perfected dubbing in every language.
Right.
They used to put a person in a booth. It was the worst. You heard the echoes. Barbara and I watched a movie last night. I swear to you, this was so bad that it was almost good. Almost. Called The Opposite Sex, 1956, where they dubbed every word out of the mouth of Joan Collins. It was dubbed, and you could hear the echoes, coming forth. And it was really not an inexpensive movie. It had all Ann Sheridan and June Allison, what have you. But Joan Collins was dubbed, not singing, talking.
They didn't know she's supposed to be American. Is that why?
Well, yes, of course.
Yeah.
Obviously, her British accent at that time couldn't be masked.
I wonder what they thought of when they cast her.
Well,
probably. My guess is the bedroom. Just kidding, guys.
Well, we're winding down now to our show. We would like to turn to our listeners. If you've made it this far, we appreciate it. Why don't you subscribe to our podcast? It's free. We're also available on the Apple, Amazon, and Spotify platforms, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. We also are available now on Facebook and Instagram. We have pages. We would really appreciate it, and please don't hesitate to recommend us to your friends and family. We have our email. If you have any questions or suggestions, just write to talesfromhollywoodland@gmail.com. Arthur, do you have a little mirth for us?
I will give you a very fast joke. A vagrant in Beverly Hills walks up to a well-dressed lady on Rodeo Drive, and he says to her, I haven't eaten in 4 days. And she responds by saying, God, I wish I had your willpower. Anybody get that joke?
Thank you, Arthur. That was great.
How about this one? Do you know what the punishment is for bigamy?
What?
two mothers-in-law. All right.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Well, have a good one.
Have a good week.
Check out the Modern Musicology podcast, where each week we talk about things like
what makes a great drummer,
our favorite rock documentaries,
songs we love by artists we don't love,
our favorite concert memories,
songs that should have been singles,
and all of our favorite music from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and now.
Do not use Modern Musicology if you're allergic to it. Modern Musicology may produce itching, dizziness, vertigo, temporary blindness, or heart palpitations. Do not taunt Modern Musicology.
Ask your doctor about switching to Modern Musicology.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping for the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.